Last week I reflected on the first of the 8 Beatitudes, blessed are the poor in spirit. And I also noted last week that the first 4 are about people in need and the last 4 about people in service. So today I wish to complete the first 4. Remember, these Beatitudes are all about the kingdom of heaven. They're not so much about what gets you into the kingdom of heaven, but they are characteristics of people who are kingdom of heaven minded. To be sure, if you recognise your total and complete dependency on God and put your faith and trust in Him, as the first Beatitude encourages us, then yes, you get into the kingdom of heaven. However, not all the other Beatitudes are keys to the kingdom, but are pointers to those who are seeking the kingdom. Further, they describe people for which the kingdom of heaven is about, created for, and wanting to be included in. So the second Beatitude is, blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted. Have you ever been in a state of mourning or been around someone who is? We find it difficult to be around such people, for in our heart of hearts we just simply don't know what to say or do. I remember so vividly when our second child, our firstborn son, Daniel, died. My wife and I were just inconsolable. To a certain extent we still are. And our lives are forever changed as a result. People did not know how to respond to us, how to interact with us. And to this day, people recoil in shock when they find out for the first time that we're bereaved parents. You can see the confusion in their eyes. They just don't know what to say or do next. There are a number of reasons for this. Mostly, we don't like death or sadness of any description. For some reason, everything should be happiness and joy and love and peace and all those sorts of joyful, yummy things that enable us to just forget about the reality of life, I suppose. Death and dying of any description, death of a marriage, death of a friendship, death of a job, all puts us into a depression and sadness. People like me who mourn are wet blankets. We're joy killers. We remind people that life is not benign and not all chuckles and happiness. Yet in this state of mourning, we find ourselves approved by God. Why? Well, because we're in need. People who mourn need help. Yet while this is all true, I think this is only part of what Jesus is on about. Remember, the first Beatitude was about the recognition of our total dependency on God. Recognition that we're sinful, fallen human beings. I think that this is part of the mourning as well. We are mourning because we have reached a state of recognition that because we've sinned against God, against our being made in the image and likeness of God, we have somehow marred God's image in us. And if we're honest about that reality, then that will cause us to mourn the loss of our innocence, the loss of the fullness of our being created in the image and likeness of God. We can also look on what is going on in our world, and we can mourn and weep for what is going on. Our silliness, our hubris, all these pile up on us and cause us to mourn for what might have been had we been better at being made in the image and likeness of God. In all of this, though, we can take heart and not fall into despair. We will be comforted. Note that we will not necessarily be taken out of the situation we find ourselves in wherein we are mournful. What we are given is the means to endure in the situation we find ourselves. We are given a future hope. We will be comforted. As Don Carson reminds us, we exchange the sackcloth of grief for the garment of praise, the ashes of grief for the oil of gladness. God is able to comfort us, for He knows true pain, true suffering. God alone understands death. Through His Son, He has passed through death to new life and is able to comfort us in ways that not even the bereaved can comfort one another. The next Beatitude is, blessed are the meek, for they will inherit the earth. The Greek term that we translate as meek has a few more nuances. It can be translated as gentle, kind, or mild. It has a sense of modesty, of virtue. Our modern English understanding of these terms might engender a sense of weakness. However, we must guard against such assumptions. Jesus is seen as gentle, meek, kind, certainly modest, yet very few would venture to describe him as weak. The commentator Brunner helpfully reminds us that Beatitudes 2 and 3 are really extensions of Beatitude 1. We are, because of where we are at in life, in no condition to make any claim on God. We're completely and totally dependent on him. However, another helpful point to note that might help us understand this beatitude a bit better is that the person who is truly meek is content. Such a person's ego is not so inflated that he or she feels that they need to have more. This is because, as Carson reminds us, when such a person looks to Jesus, he or she sees himself as possessing everything. Brunner helps us further by pointing to the trial of Jesus as an example of meekness. In that time before Pilate, we see neither aggression nor assertiveness, simply poise, complete and total trust that God is in charge, and that nothing that happens around Jesus is without God's hand in it, because he's totally focused on God and God's purpose, he is content. This needs to be us as well. The final of the fourth one of those first four is hungering and thirsting for righteousness. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they will receive righteousness. This is not about, we seek satisfaction in so many things in the world, and yet do we really find satisfaction? I think in one sense this is probably the most difficult of the Beatitudes to get to grips with. This is because most of us has not really experienced real deprivation. We have not really hungered and thirsted for anything. My children up until now have not experienced difficulties in this life. I haven't experienced too much. Everything has been pretty simple for them. But now with this pandemic, life has turned upside down. Job security is out the window. Where are we going to get money for food, for shelter, etc.? Most of us seek to be filled with something, love in our life, job satisfaction, being satisfied in our lives in general. But what happens though when the satisfaction we seek is not found in the world? Where will we find it? I think Carson is right. The satisfaction we seek comes from conforming our lives to the will of God. That is where we find righteousness. So the one who hungers and thirsts for righteousness is the one who hungers to conform their will to the will of God. And when they do that, then they will be satisfied. In a very real sense, this can only occur once we have actually understood what it means to be poor in spirit, to mourn, and to be meek. Once we understand these, then we realize two truths. First, we're totally and utterly dependent on God. And second, we can't have these states we're in resolved unless we conform our will to the will of God. That can only happen, it turns out, by being a disciple of Jesus. And that's why it's in the Sermon on the Mount, which is all about being a disciple of Jesus. I'm reminded of the words of a chorus I used to sing in the church in the 80s by Lauren Daigle. One of the verses is, "Turn your eyes upon Jesus, look full in his wonderful face, and the things of this earth will grow strangely dim in the light of his glory and grace." This is the challenge for us that the Beatitudes present to us. We have to turn our eyes upon Jesus and look full in his wonderful face. And when we do that, we will recognize that we are spiritually poor. We're in a state of mourning as a result, and we will need to discover meekness. And in doing that, we are then in a position to hunger and thirst for righteousness, and thereby to be truly satisfied by conforming our will to the will of God in his Son Jesus. When we do these things, then indeed the things of this world will fade into insignificance. They will still be there, but they will take on a new perspective. We will have a new understanding, a new paradigm, if you will. Recognizing our total and complete dependence of God is the purpose of the first 4 Beatitudes. They are critical for understanding who we are before God, and when we do understand who we truly are before God, then we will be in a better position to participate in the next 4, which are the Beatitudes of service, and we'll also be in a better position to be truly the disciples of the Lord Jesus. The Lord be with you.